Hey up and welcome to the Temple of Bleh. This is a conversation with the king of Roadrunner Australia, John Satterley. John's career with Roadrunner began in 1995, heading up the Australian office until he was promoted to Senior VP of New Media and Global Business Development in the New York office in the mid-2000s. His current venture, most importantly, is Fortress Melbourne, which marries up my interests with metal and video games perfectly. So you'd want to do yourself a favour and check out Fortress Melbourne. Just give it a googs, mate, and check it out. This conversation I found incredibly interesting because Australia as an entity musically and for business is kind of a blind spot for me. So John did a really good job in articulating the experience that he had at such an interesting time in musical history. Anyway, enough of my rambling. It's too early for this shit. 1, 2, fuck it up. So let's jump straight into it and tell me everything about Fortress Australia, because looking at your career history, most of the time the career trajectory of people at Roadrunner is it stays within the music industry and it stays usually in it kind of like a contractor capacity as people enter their retirement years. But you just went balls deep into something completely different, which resonates with me massively as someone who plays video games.
Well, yeah, but funnily enough, it wasn't exactly by choice because, I was working for Roadrunner in New York and then and Warner Music bought us. And then, one fateful day, which you may have heard already from some of the other staff that were there, a lot of us just copped a bullet in the back of the head and we were done. So my fated career in the music industry kind of ended rather abruptly without my sort of say in it. I didn't voluntarily eject myself from the music industry. And it was always my dream and passion to be in the music industry. So then what happened was I decided to take up an opportunity back in Australia to work for Village Roadshow, which is one of the biggest entertainment companies in Australia, or it's sort of been recently bought out. But it was, theme parks, cinemas, movies, distribution, all of that I thought I wanted to have a crack at something that was a little beyond music because of what had happened. I thought maybe it's time to stretch the wings and have a ping at entertainment in general, not just music.
Yeah. And
that went for 5 and a bit years. And then all along, I really thought along that period, well, I work for Roadrunner because my first love and the thing I love most in life is metal. And then the second thing I like most in life is video games. Obviously, parking my children, my wife and all that. I'm talking about my personal fascinations and passions is metal and games. And so I figured I really just have to, if I've done one for the bulk of the first half of my career, then, and I didn't see that any real chance of getting into anything with metal again for the time being. So games was the option. And I'd been thinking a lot about it while I was at Village Roadshow. Mm-hmm. And I put some ideas together to the board at Village, and they didn't want to do it for a whole bunch of reasons and didn't have the money or the wherewithal and everything. And so I was really keen to do it and decided to leave the company and have a stab at raising the money effectively from scratch and trying to build something. And the stars aligned and I met a couple of guys who are serial successful entrepreneurs, and then they had all the skill sets that I didn't have about how the hell do you raise money from scratch and do that. And then they brought a lot of that and a heap of other skills in, and we were able to set Fortress up. And from that in a sort of early 2018 to when we opened, it took 2.5 years of planning and building and creating Fortress Melbourne. And here we are now. So nearly 3 years later, where, well, without COVID, we would be in a slightly different position, but we certainly have had a pretty good run. And since opening again we were shut for 9 months because of COVID, and then we opened again in January. And since we opened in January, apart from this current week when it's gone to shit again because we've had to close, but the business has just been growing week on week, quite extraordinary sort of growth. So a lot of the things that we believed in have started to be validated, that people will want to hang out and play board games and video games and pay good money to have an extraordinary experience in a blue ribbon platinum type sort of LAN gaming and arena, and whether it be esports or just beers with your mates playing Dungeons and Dragons, all of that's part of Fortress. And a lot of the ideas we had a couple of years ago are starting to bear fruit that people have validated and said, that is what we want to do. And one way we describe our business these days is that we build pubs for Zoomers. We really do.
Yeah, no, that's that. So I mean, because esports isn't necessarily a brand new thing. It's been going on for a while. There was a lot of fringe activity in sort of the early 2010s, and then it's become sort of more legitimized, and now it's effectively a AAA industry, or it's at least, maybe if you want to call it AAB, moving into AAA. So what's the ecosphere in Australia for this? Because it's usually a US-centric operation, isn't it?
Yeah, well, I'm glad you asked, Jim, because it's not. In fact, when we started the business, we called it Fortress Esports. And those early days when I was pitching ideas before we actually founded the company, esports was at the heart of the idea. But since the business has grown and matured and we've been open, esports actually is only a very tiny part of our business model and a tiny part of our aspirations and what we hope to do as a business. So. Whilst, and a lot of it's recognition that esports is focused on the sort of 1% of elite gaming. It's professional. It's all about the pinnacle of games experience. Yeah. And we realized that as a business that can't sustain a business model, right? It's just not in Australia in particular, where, like you just said, the US and the big money and China, there's just not that talent and that level of professionalism and that level of prize money and support. So we had to figure out, how do you make a business out of live social video game playing? And it's certainly not through esports alone. It's got to come from social, grassroots, mates hanging out, playing COD together over some beers, not people coming and paying to watch elite, training 10 hours a day type CSGO players who that's just not how it works. Just no one's going to, you might get one of those a year. And so our business is all about, like I said, almost like we're building themed restaurants or pubs for Zoomers, because Fortress is all about an incredible experience of the characters we created, the fantasy themes in the tavern, all of the pieces all combined, even the esports piece, all sort of the sums greater than the parts, as it were. And that's what you get when you come to Fortress.
I think the esports part is, I guess it's mostly repertoire, but if your brand is mostly about setting up the brick and mortar element to that culture, that's sort of unique in itself.
It is, but we also built a pretty formidable studio. So we have big, fat production and broadcast facilities, so we can actually run competitive, but we often refer to esports as competitive gaming. So we love the idea that because esports often connotes elite gatekeeping and hard, like the average person on the street can't play. Whereas we like the idea that any shit kicker can come and have a ping, and, there might be some prize money, not necessarily for the elite 1%, but just turning up on the day and having a good go. You have great fun, but you might win something just for having a go. It's certainly not trying to make out that we don't like elite gaming. We do, but just for a business, we have to be able to accommodate and make sure that we're not just appealing to the elite, because there's just not enough of them.
Yeah. So how many sites have you got then? Is it just the super site at Melbourne at the minute?
Just Melbourne, and then we're actually pretty close to, hopefully in the next little while, we're close to signing a lease for Fortress Sydney. We've got a great property we're looking at for Fortress Adelaide. We've got the model's also changed, that we've got some plans to build. So those are flagships like Melbourne, where they have a giant arena and an enormous floor plate, like 2,700 square metres. Melbourne's enormous. What we also want to start doing are more, not hole in the wall, but, when you go to a shopping centre and they've got like a bowling alley and they've got like a what we call them holy moly, like a mini golf thing. And they've got all those little entertainment sections inside like a shopping mall on the third or fourth floor, where you get it all combined. And there might be a pub. Well, we want to start, we've got an idea to bring a sort of truncated version of Fortress into those entertainment precincts in shopping malls, so they don't have to be, we don't have to build an enormous flagship. We could be building something about half the size of a flagship, but they could be sitting in those suburban and regional shopping centres, but they're all networked into the flagship. So you turn up and you play video games, you hang out and do stuff as a member at a suburban Fortress, and then you can, if you're a competitor or whatever, that an elite event or a grand final or something could be happening at the mothership, at the flagship.
Yeah. So what are you playing now these days, as in you personally? Just out of interest.
Me personally, well, funnily enough, I'm not a good first-person shooter player. I like to play COD, but my favorite game of all time is Civilization. So I sort of like a slow. I'm old, so I've been playing Civ for 30 years, and Civ 6 I would have put over nearly 2,000 hours playing Civ 6, and I just love it. I just keep coming back to it whenever I'm thinking, what game can I play? I've got a couple of hours spare. I just keep spinning up another Civ game, and I've grown to where I'm not at deity level, but I can win games at Immortal. And so I've been pretty proud of that. And I certainly like to play different Civs and testing my skills at, whether it's I've just been playing last night as one of the Cree civilization to try and win in the Cree. I don't know if you play, but that's
ever since Civ 1. Civ 1 it came in as a package with a Windows 95 PC, which I got when I was a kid, and I've played every single one since then. Civ 6 is at the minute, I mentioned earlier, Battlegrounds 3 is that's my editing game, because you can jump in and out without much. So I can edit this later, and I'll be probably playing Battlegrounds 3, but Civ 6 is still up there and installed for sometimes I know it's going to be a slog. I had a 2.5 hour conversation with Mike Varney from Shrapnel Records last week. I was like, that might take a while. So set it up in Audacity, get ready to edit, spin up a play now, get going. It's brilliant. We'd do another one, right? We'd do another Civ set. We'll do Civ 7 soon, really, given their life cycle. But they keep adding more season pass things and things.
They were awesome, those season passes. The DLC and the season passes were terrific, right? And then adding all the additions to Civ 6, like the the weather or whatever it's called, I forget Rise and Fall and Gathering Storm and all of that. I mean, these are just awesome additions that make the game so more interesting. So, I mean, you think, what can Civ 7 do? I'm waiting for this new game. Have you seen the new game Humankind?
I've seen things of it.
Yeah, I'll give it a go.
The curve required to put me into another turn-based strategy is quite substantial. One which I don't think I've got. The thing is, right, this entire Roadrunner project, it's born of two things, right? One, I couldn't get enough mates to start a CSGO clan and team, right? Because I wanted to do just local level tournaments for a laugh. Sure. And another thing is I'm addicted, unhealthily addicted to Stardew Valley. So I need,
really?
I
played that a fair bit, but I'm not addicted to it.
They've just dropped a new update on it, which substantially increases the replayability. So I'm I need something else which is gonna keep me productive. So that's what this Roadrunner thing came from. But you should check out Stardew Valley because the co-op.
I have played it. No, I've got it. No, I played it. I meant in 50 hours.
A professional capacity, because they're thinking about doing a competitive version of it, the way that the co-op operates.
Really?
It can be sort of manipulated into a competitive nature. I don't know exactly what it is. I think it must be something to do with how you'd measure revenue, because it's all revenue driven, isn't it, in terms of how much your farm can make.
Yeah, but I would have thought it's almost the antithesis of the whole ethos of Stardew Valley, which is
Definitely.
Not at all to be stressed and compete. It's the whole point of that game is to just chillax and play.
I completely agree, which is exactly why the antithesis should exist.
Right, yeah, fair enough. Why not? Give it a go.
But yeah, that's my thing. Oh, Dead by Daylight as well. I'm playing that I have to play that with mates though, otherwise it's just too frustrating.
I got it on my list, and I've got to try this game that I just saw is on sale today. That 4X game, a bit like Civ, or it's a city builder, the Frost Punk.
Yes, that is. I've got that on my wish list, and again, it's one I've not adopted because I don't want to take the time to learn it when I'm in the middle of stuff. But yeah,
Steam's got a big discount on it. It's 60% off at Steam at the moment. I thought, I might have to look at that. So
my mate sent me a screenshot of the loading screen of that, and it's just a Victorian era young girl sort of in a coat looking really miserable, and a little a lower third saying, "This is Wendy. She dreams of bread and sun." And it's just grim as fuck.
Yeah, I know, I love it. So, and it's like Civ with bleak grimness. So I thought I might have to check it out. So yeah, there's a few games to look at, and probably Civ, and the best game I've ever played in terms of just impact and amazement would be The Last of Us.
Right. The
first one. I mean, in terms of just story and just, to me, that's equal to any movie, right? In terms of experience, hands down, that beats any sort of show or movie. That just was an awesome game experience. And The Witcher 3 was pretty awesome too.
I would say the exact same thing about Metal Gear Solid, the first one.
Metal Gear Solid, that was good, but I didn't put in as many hours, but I finished The Last of Us. I mean, Mass Effect 1, 2, and 3 were awesome as well. Yeah. But Civ 6 is just that game that I just always I'll jump in and play those other games, but Civ 6 is just my go-to game all the time as my backup. If I'm just got some hours to kill, Civ 6 is what I play.
Completely agree. So where can people check out Fortress?
Well, you can go to fortressmelbourne.com. And especially if you're not in Australia, then you can have a sticky there and have a look at it and see what we do. And it's actually upgrading the website soon, so it'll be a better showcase. But it's a good way to see everything that you can do at Fortress. And anyone who's ever listening to this and was one day when tourists are allowed back into Australia, we're hoping, of course, it's certainly you or anyone visiting Australia who is into culture and pop culture and games. You would not visit Melbourne without going to Fortress Melbourne. It'd be absolutely a travesty. We want to make it like going to visit the MCG. You've got to go to Fortress Melbourne.
I can't wait. I'm going to check it out. In fact, I don't think we've got anything quite. We had an e-cafe where I am in Leeds, which was obviously scaled down. It was just like literally a Starbucks with like a an upgraded internet cafe effectively. But this weekend it's my birthday, so I'm going to go to one of the start doing like ticketed arcades. So it's like arcades with such a robust catalog of old arcade titles, and it's like 15 quid. You just go in for the entire day. You don't have to put in your 20p's and stuff like that. So I'm going to try one of those out.
Well, we have arcade games, and in fact, Fortress Sydney, one of the things we learned is we need a bigger arcade sort of offering at Fortress. We have some in Fortress Melbourne, but when we build Sydney, we're going to build a big, fat arcade zone with about 30 or 40 machines. So that'll be a big sort of change in our orientation as well. So there'll be LAN gaming, competitive esports, and arcade, and tabletop, and board game, and RPG. So the whole thing all under one roof. But yeah, I mean, we want to build one in the UK. We've actually had people approach us and say, when's Fortress coming to the UK? We're like, well, we'd love to be able to get on a plane and kick some tires, but until we can get out of the country, that might still be another year or two. But we definitely have plans to move our brand into other markets outside of Australia for sure.
Yeah, well, definitely keep me posted.
Yeah.
Let's jump into the meat of my academic venture, the thing that's keeping me away from esports and Stardew Valley, and that is Roadrunner mother flipping records. So your remit in Roadrunner is effectively king of operations and MD of the Australian branch. This is a blind spot to me for many reasons. A lot of it is because Australian musically as a culture, it deals with music differently. It's a different kind of territory. It's a unique territory. You could even put it up there with Japan in terms of like how departed it is from, say, the New York and European operation. And the way the satellite offices work in conjunction with the wider brand intrigues me, because I think that Roadrunner as an entity and its legacy and its function, it did something that no other label did. It was an incredibly prestigious indie to the point that maybe hasn't necessarily been achieved since. And that's what the project's all about, is trying to unpack and reverse engineer that so we understand how we can administrate metal these days. Yeah, sure. So let's go through the chronology, and I've sent some questions, but really those are kind of by the numbers questions about the chronology. Really, we're going to ping pong and ping all over the place, because I'll have loads of daft, stupid, intrigue questions that most people will find boring, but I find really interesting.
No, let's do it. I've got answers.
Let's talk about how you were recruited by Case and how the opportunity came to your shores.
Yeah, so I was working. I did a law degree and an arts degree at Melbourne Uni, and while I was doing that, I worked in record stores around Melbourne. So I worked at some famous stores. One still exists, called Greville Records, and I was working at another sort of punk type indie store called Missing Link that doesn't exist anymore. And I was just opening the stores on Saturdays. I used to clean the toilets at Greville Records. I'd do anything just to be part of the music business, even while I was studying. And when I finished my degrees, I was able to get a job. I didn't want to be a lawyer, so I chose to work packing boxes at a small distribution company called Siren Records, which was a local independent distributor doing, they did a lot of imports. So they would be, in those days, Australia had a huge parallel import business where companies would be bringing in CDs and albums from the US, which were mostly those titles that weren't being made available by the local major labels. So
it's worth mentioning what parallel importing is in that sense. It is like it's not quite piracy, but it's aftermarket supply, isn't it?
Yeah, so the major labels in Australia, whether, Sony's or in those days CBS or whatever, all the different Polygram, all those companies that don't exist anymore, really, they would release the local, repertoire of they would press vinyl or CDs of, maybe only sometimes 40 or 50% of the entire available repertoire, and the other 50% were either they just didn't bother sometimes, right? So they didn't even bother bringing them into Australia. Or certainly they wouldn't, of course, press them because they might only be selling 3 a week of a certain title. And so they wouldn't bother. And they wouldn't sometimes even staff up a local import, like a little import department within their business. And if they did, they were usually poorly managed. So these independent companies like Siren would emerge to fill those gaps because, good example, for about 4 years, the entire back catalogue of the Red Hot Chili Peppers, apart from Blood Sugar Sex Magic, wasn't available in Australia locally. So Siren were just selling truckloads of that, boxes of it each week we were bringing in from the US, wow. Just selling to all the little record stores around the country who couldn't get it anywhere else, right? So it was also that either they couldn't get it or the price, we could get it in cheaper from the US and land it cheaper and sell it to them cheaper than they were getting sold by the label out of Sydney or wherever usually the major labels are all headquartered in Sydney. So I worked there, and we just kick the footy and wait for the shipments to arrive on a Monday, and then we cut the boxes open and just pick and pack all the CDs that arrived from the US, and then they'd be all shipped off to all the different little record stores or big record stores. In fact, there were all the big chains in those days, and you just be doing endless amounts of stuff. And then about 2 years into doing that, and I was working in the record stores, and I actually traveled overseas for a year, so I took a kind of classic gap year as well. Came back, didn't know what to do, and I'd set up on invitation from the bosses there. They wanted me to start doing local distribution. So there was tons of local bands around Australia that just didn't have distribution, right? And it was like doing what's called a P&D deal, a packaging and distribution deal, where we would sign them to this deal, and it wasn't like a record deal where you pay royalties. It was more like we take a distribution fee, and then they'd get the net. We'd sell it for a wholesale price to the stores, take a distribution fee, and then the band would get the balance. And then we would recoup the cost of the manufacturing and everything of the CDs, and maybe a small marketing fund, and then we would pay the net proceeds back to the bands.
All right.
So I was into that. I was about 22, 23, and I was, living the dream, going out to see bands all the time anyway. And there was just a very vibrant scene in Melbourne at the time, at the Punters Club and the Evelyn Hotel and all these pubs and bars and the Espy and all these famous venues, some of which don't exist anymore. And I'd be seeing bands all the time. And then I was managing some bands as well. And then it was sort of like, hey, John, it was a natural thing to set this label up, this little mini distribution label. And we ended up building it up pretty good. I had about 150 bands on the label at the point when it was a classic. I mean, I didn't know what to do with my life, really. I was enjoying that, but parents are, getting hassled like, you're going to be a lawyer one day, and didn't know what to do. And all I knew, I wanted to be involved in music and be in the music industry. So one day there was an ad in one of the weekly street papers, the music street papers. There was in Melbourne, they were called Beat and Impress. And there was an ad, I think it was in Impress or Beat. Basically, it was just a little ad there used to be an industry page just about what's happening in the music industry. And there was like a little quarter-page ad saying, something like International Record Company seeking general manager.
Okay. And,
I'd never applied for a job in my life, and I didn't know. I was just a kid. And I just had the catalogue, that was like a photocopied, stapled catalogue of the Siren titles, or like my catalogue, and some CDs and a letter I wrote, and I just put it in an envelope and sent it as a sort of with my resume. Heard nothing for about 3 months, so just forgot about it. and then got a call from a recruiting company that was called, was run by a guy named Phil Tripp, who ran like the Australian music industry directory out of Sydney. And he'd been hired by Shock Records to find this general manager. And they asked me if I'd come in for an interview. I was like, oh, I almost forgot about it. I was like, oh yeah, hell yeah, I'll do that. And I remember just turning up with a pile of my latest CDs that I'd released, and it was pretty intimidating. And they, interviewed me like a really formal interview, and I'd never done one before. And I was pretty, just green. I was just talking about my bands and how I managed bands and how I was all immersed in the culture and the bands. And that was it. And then again, I heard nothing for about another month. And then David Williams, who was the boss and founder of Shock Records, I got a call from him, and he wanted to meet me at a pub up the road in Brunswick. And he said, can you meet me for a beer and a chat? I said, yeah, okay, I'll come after work. And then we chatted, and basically he said, look, I love you, John. I'd like to talk to you about this job. Can you take a phone call from Case? And I was like, who's this guy? And that night I got home and Case called me. And I remember David Williams had offered me $35,000. And I talked to my mate who I was living with, and he goes, there's no way, general manager, John, you should ask for $45,000. And I remember saying to Case, because I didn't really know, and then I knew it was Roadrunner. And what was funny was, I was, since I'd been a kid, sworn to metal, and it was my religion in my life. But I hadn't, and we'll talk about it some more, but the Roadrunner bands at that point weren't really in my sort of category of bands that I listened to. Mm-hmm. So I was more trad metal guy. Like I was Maiden and Priest and Queensryche, and that's my Dio and Sabbath, and that was sort of the 80s tunes. So the only big Roadrunner album that I loved was Burn My Eyes, and I thought that was out because this is 1995. Mm-hmm. And so I knew Burn My Eyes, and I fucking love that record, right? Davidian and Old and all those songs. So I was like, holy shit. So that was the one record I knew I could talk about, and I was telling Case that how I loved Machine Head, and it was awesome. And then I boldly said, look, John, I'd love to hire you. I think you'd be great. Would you come aboard? I said, well, I would, Case, but I'm just a bit concerned about the salary. I mean, I just, I've come out of uni, and I think he goes, well, what do you want? I said, 45. He says, okay. Didn't even use that. Okay. When can you start? I said, I don't know, as soon as possible. He goes, okay. So I just went, all right, I'm in, and didn't know what to expect. And I remember probably a week or so, I gave notice at Siren, and then I started at Roadrunner, and it was based out of Shock Records. And Shock Records had this really ramshackle old warehouse where they had all of the album they did the pick and pack from, but they also had their offices. And it was kind of in this shitty part of inner northern suburbs of Melbourne, where it was in an industrial broken down estate with a crappy coffee company that roasted the coffee beans. It stank the whole joint out every morning. I remember rocking up for my first day, and David Williams said g'day, and we met, and we'd organised to meet like 9 a.m. or 10 a.m. on the Monday. And then he goes, welcome, John, here you go. And I met Andrew McGee, who was the other founder of Shock, and they just gave me like a cardboard box. And they go, that's Roadrunner Records. And you're now the boss. And I was like, oh yeah. And by the way, you got to meet a guy, Bob Stevenson. He's been working for Roadrunner, and you're now his boss. So I was 24 and Bob was 38.
Right.
So that was excruciating. And even though we're fantastic friends now, we worked together every day for 12 years, I don't think he talked to me for the first 12 months.
Jesus.
Because I was like, a long-haired, just grungy metal scumbag who just somehow got this gig. And he was a very dapper ex-EMI. He'd like been Queen's publicist from EMI out of the UK, and he knew Elton John, were all his mates. And here he was, because he'd migrated to Australia, and now suddenly he's got this scumbag as the boss at Roadrunner. And he'd been sort of the de facto chief of Roadrunner. And it was pretty awkward. But anyway, that was my start. That's how I started at Roadrunner. And then it was, I didn't even have a CD player. I was just sitting in a room with 35 other people in a big open plan office. And I just was given a desk we're all just sitting there and just a box. And it's like, that's Roadrunner, John, figure it out.
So it's interesting because that's pretty much the experience of the LA office as well.
Yeah.
Like just a corner of another office where presumably Case had a network. They said, well, let's just try it there. And then we don't have to pay for the brick and mortar. We have to rent or lease anyway. And then if it works, it works. Great. I wonder why Bob was where he was. Was it because you clearly knew the territory more?
Case wanted me to sign bands. So his main interest in Australia was for us to expand Australia with local repertoire.
Right.
And I think what won me the job was there'd been a lot of, I suppose, people that were competing for the job. And I knew at the time some people who were going for the job as the general manager of Roadrunner were people who were in the industry, like maybe some PR people and promo people, and even a couple of people. I remember one guy was a journalist at one of those street magazines who was going for the job. But I think I got the job because I actually had signed 150 bands to my label. Now, of course, it wasn't like as formal as a record label. It was a distribution company. But I had 150 bands and I managed bands. So I to Case at the time, I was the perfect candidate because I talked the talk. I actually had signed and distributed bands and had direct relationships with scores of bands that I was friendly with that I was distributing. So I think that's what he was looking for at the time.
I guess for you, the difference would have been taking that packaging distribution model, which you had, and just going, all right, well, now we need to add a few percent to actually make money. And that's kind of the core difference, right? Well,
it was a trial by fire. It was a shocking kind of early year. My first year was very confronting of learning. I mean, I didn't do business at uni, and I hadn't studied economics, and I didn't even know when I was being told about P&Ls, like what profit and loss. Yeah, I didn't know what a P&L was. And this is 1995 when, there was no Wikipedias and all that. This is like the computer I started on at Shock was using WordStar. It was like a DOS machine. It wasn't a Windows machine. And I remember Case agreed for me to buy one of those mid-90s Apple computers. It wasn't a Mac. It was like an Apple 9500 that had it was like a basic Macintosh in the sense of a, black and white screen and all this sort of shit. And the internet we didn't have the internet at Shock in 95. So everything was done by fax. And it was that sort of world that I was in. And suddenly I was trying to, I was being asked to put forward a sales budget. And I remember from Holland, where the headquarters was, I was sent a list of all of the titles that were being forecast for the forthcoming year. And they asked me to put budgets together for this, like how many albums am I going to sell? How much money do I need? And all this. And I mean, I'd been working on no budgets and hand to mouth, the rawest indie world that you could ever imagine. If Roadrunner was indie, then I was coming from the gutter of indie, right, where there was just 50. I'd have to ask to do a $60 ad in a paper would be a miracle if I could get that. And then Case was saying, what do you need? And well, not Case, it was a guy named Stefan Koster out of Holland, who was the head of international at the time. He's like, well, John, you need to tell me how many albums you're going to sell for this band. And I was like, Life of Agony, Ugly, I don't even know who that band is. And so I had a huge learning curve. I remember being sent from Holland, and I took them all off the warehouse shelves, the ones that I didn't have copies of, just about 200 albums. And I remember I bought a little portable CD player and I just rotated. I remember listening to Bloody Kisses, Typo Negative, and that's now one of my favorite albums of all time. But I think I listened to that about 500 times in 3 months just to sort of soak it in, and then even some terrible records that are almost practically unlistenable these days, like Life of Agony Ugly, which was the new release of Life of Agony in 95, which is a shocking record. And they were asking me, how many of them are you going to sell? And I was like, well, what, 300, 500, 5,000? So those first budgets were an absolute disaster because I had no idea how to position the business or the market or what the appetite would be. I didn't know. So I was just flying blind with very little formal record business or economic or commerce understanding. And I was just like a shit kicker trying to sign bands and fumble my way through. And I guess I was reasonably clever, so I was able to sort of, work it out. I remember studying QuickBooks I was in the office till 11 o'clock at night for about 2 months, just trying to learn from scratch how accounting works, because I didn't even know how to do the local books, because I had to now do all the accounts receivable and payable. So that was fun though. Like, it was a bit, that's what's been fun even with Fortress, starting a business with Fortress. It reminded me of those early days at Roadrunner when you're just figuring it out as you go. Yeah. And just, you know, devil may care attitude. It was kind of fun what Roadrunner was like in those early days. It was really rough, but Case, to his credit, had huge amounts of belief in me, and just, you know, he must have been laughing, you know, just letting me go. Just, don't worry about it, John, just go.
So we had mentioned the Australian operation it seemed to be an A&R strategy, an A&R move to get some Australian local repertoire on the go.
That's right.
What's that? How important is that to Roadrunner as a global entity? Because let's talk about Australia as an industry as it stands, because not a lot of Australia is populated. So you've got presumably a few key sites and territories which you're measuring, right?
Yeah, I mean, Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, right there you've got about 60% of the country's population, and then Adelaide, Perth, and, you know, the rest, and then some regional. So the bulk of the business, you know, everyone lives, 25 million people live around the perimeter of the country largely, right? So it's not a difficult territory to manage, in that it's not like the States where there's, you know, 500 markets and 5,000 radio stations and Christ knows what else. Australia is much more, you know, you had some pretty linear paths to market. In those days, you had the big chains, and you had Triple J hadn't really gone national in those days. In the early mid-90s, it just started Triple J, which was one of the most important radio stations.
Right, okay.
To great bands. And then commercial radio wouldn't touch Roadrunner stuff. Like, metal was just not, metal and underground music. We had like punk band like Shelter. They just weren't, in those mid-90s, they wouldn't touch those bands. And not like America, where you had active rock, where they would play Christian Woman, for instance, to death, right? They wouldn't touch, you just would never get that on radio in Australia. So from the very beginning, the challenges we had were that we didn't have radio markets that were mirroring what you had in the US or even in the UK. We had in Australia in the mid-90s some publications, like we had an Australian Kerrang for a while, and we had a magazine called Hot Metal, which went into the 90s, went for a few years, and that was pretty good. And, you know, JB Hi-Fi, and, well, that actually hadn't really blown up as a big chain, but Barash's was a big chain, and Sanity. These chain stores that existed in Australia some of them had hard rock and metal sections, and a lot of people would just find their new music by going there. Yeah. So what it was clear to me was that, and to Case's surprise, because I was clearly a sworn to metal guy, the first band I signed to Roadrunner wasn't a metal band. It was a alternative hard rock punk kind of anarchist kind of band called Non-Intentional Lifeform. Yep. And then I signed a pop band, an indie pop band called Effigy. So the first two bands I signed to the label were not at all metal. Although a lot of people have now told me, and I think it's true, that Non-Intentional Lifeform was like System of a Down 3 years before that band came out.
I get that.
And Non-Intentional Lifeform's become a bit of a famous, you know, amongst the hardcore underground, people acknowledged that band was extraordinary, right? And they just kind of imploded. And Effigy were the same. We had Effigy between 95 and 98. They blew up as quite a big band, and then they imploded, which was horrible, which was life lessons for me about, you know, A&R isn't just about good records. It's about relation and how keeping an eye on how they internally, the bands work with each other, because the bands had internal strife and it went to shit. Yeah. So nonetheless, you know, the strategy for our A&R in Australia wasn't really just signing metal, because metal, we can talk about it later, about my view in hindsight about Roadrunner in general. But at the time in the mid-90s, I felt that the right direction was for us to go after a more indie sort of, you know, alternative and indie focus, because we had more chance to get radio with Triple J and the alternative, like local Melbourne stations like Triple R and PBS, and in Sydney they had the stations escape me, but every capital city of Australia had very vibrant and very influential local sort of community radio. And I felt like we had a better chance of having success if we were and these were great bands. It wasn't a cynical, like just, A&R cynicism. These were good bands, and I felt that this would be a better shot for us. And at the time, I remember when I signed NIL, there was a lot of talk before I arrived at Roadrunner that everyone was telling me I was going to sign this band called Damaged, who were the biggest metal band in Melbourne and one of the biggest metal bands in Australia. And I kept getting told, everyone kept giving me these rumors like, we're going to sign Damaged. And I said, I'm not signing Damaged. Everyone keeps telling me I'm going to sign them. I'm not signing them. And,
why not?
And because they were sort of like full on extreme grindcore and extreme metal. And I didn't mind them, but they just had zero commerciality at the time.
Yeah.
They would, and I knew that Case would never have agreed, and Monty was obviously seconding a lot of these bands. Monty's one of my mates, and we've known each other for 25 years, and he'd laugh because he hates everything that I ever signed, but he pretty much hates everything that most people sign apart from whatever he signed. Not fully true, but I don't think anything I ever signed he liked. And but then again, Monty's a very US focused fella, right? He just wasn't he just didn't understand the conditions of our market. But I wouldn't disagree that most of the metal bands that I sent his way were shit, and I'm glad he didn't let me sign them. And that's for another conversation. But metal in Australia, for me, there's been quite a few good metal bands, but I've never felt that this has been, for a country of 25 million. If you compare Australia to, say, Finland or Sweden, we have more people by miles than they have. Yet we've not ever developed a metal scene anywhere near the Scandinavian or the Finnish or whatever. I mean, it's just not close. And you kind of wonder and I've got a lot of theories about that. And it's unfortunate because I would have loved to have left a legacy where there was, powerful and incredible metal bands that had been signed. And I did sign a few over the years at Roadrunner, but none really ended up mirroring the kind of success, not even close to what the world's seeing from other countries.
So taking a step back, so those are the market challenges. It's not necessarily commercial viability for metal, and you do the right thing by kind of expanding the horizons of the label, which is what they were doing in New York anyway. They were going like an alternative and indie way. So it kind of makes sense. But so let's pull that back to your first week where you're like, shit, I don't know how to throw a budget together with these sales. But obviously over time you're realizing what you're up against.
Yeah.
Do you eventually, how do you then start liaising with the main sites like in Amsterdam and New York, and then be able to start providing credible budgets and credible output? How does that transition happen?
Yeah, well, that's funny because I started working for Roadrunner in, I think, September of 95. And then in December, I was flown over to Amsterdam for my first meeting that was when I first met Monty and all the team in Amsterdam. And, what was ironic was only a year earlier in December or September of 94, I'd been in Amsterdam backpacking, sleeping sort of rough in a shitty hostel. And 1 year later, I was working for Roadrunner, sleep, in a nice hotel in Amsterdam, living the dream out, whereas I remembered when I'd been there, I couldn't even afford a beer, and I couldn't even afford a 20 guilder throw at the coffee shop. And here I was a year later living like for me, I was 24 thinking I was the king of the world as a record company executive for this international, record company that was a metal label. It was like my dream, right? And I was. And so I met everybody. And that was my first big introduction to what Roadrunner was and the culture. And I remember going out with a bunch of the crazies from all the bosses, Hank, who was the boss of Germany, and his name, there was a fella who was the boss of France who was a wild guy. And
Alexandra.
No, it was, it'll come to me because Nora was the boss for years after he left, and he was a great guy. His name will come to me. And then we had a fella from Japan, Shuska, who was there. We had all the global people, and Monty, and we had a guy, Scott Givens and Mark Abramson, and some of those guys were in Amsterdam. It was all the kind of, the guys who I grew up with in the Roadrunner team from the 90s. And I remember going out one first night being there, and we were hitting one of the bars in the red light district, getting initiated shots of Jaeger. I mean, it was awesome, right? It was just there I was going, holy shit, how did this happen? And meeting the guys from, in those days, you know, metal was so big in Holland and in Europe as well. Like there was Dynamo, and there was, Holland had 2 metal mags, like Aardschok, I think was the name of one of them. And it was just the culture was massive around metal, and just, you know, I remember just all the merch was awesome. I met Angelique, who was the head of Blue Grape merchandising in Holland, and just seeing all the T-shirts, and I was just like, fuck, this is just exactly what my life, everything I wanted in my life was here, right? Just in this culture, with these bands, with these people who are all in the same sort of world as me. What was always interesting, though, and that was the source of tension between myself and Case, in a good way, but it was definitely tension for 17 years, because I worked for Roadrunner, 17 and a half years, was that that Case was never, metal was not his religion. That was always the tension, right? That was always perhaps the story of your podcast, or the story of Roadrunner Records, is the fascinating tension between the founder and the people, and the fact that most of us who were the lifers were sworn metal guys, and that was what we believed we wanted with the label, what we wanted to fashion, and what we felt was the right course of action. And, you know, that's to be discussed, but the ultimate end of Roadrunner as we knew it, when Warner bought us and everything else, my 5 years in New York was certainly the story of like just fighting that problem, that, you know, saying if we only double down and be true to our roots and what we are as a metal label, we could conquer the world. And that we lost that argument, right? And that was but in the mid 90s, when we were thriving with Machine Head and Fear Factory and Typo Negative and all these classic, Sepultura, of course. I mean, my first record, the first big record that I released, was in February 96. So I'd been working since August or September. And the big album, and the thing that we were really meeting about in December of 95, was the forthcoming Roots album.
Right.
And that was like the whole point of that international meeting really was the playback session of Roots.
Yeah.
And the whole marketing. We spent a whole day talking about marketing Roots. And, you know, all of us were just absolutely fucking just floored by how good this record was. Like, just, this is a watershed, right? And to that end, when I got back to Australia, we mounted a mighty marketing campaign, the likes of which would never have been seen ever. And I can say that because I've got evidence to that effect. In the history of Australian music industry, we put the biggest, to that date, marketing campaign around like a proper metal record. I'm not talking about fucking Aerosmith. I'm talking about like a genuine underground metal record.
Yeah.
And we shipped platinum of that record. So we shipped 70,000 records. David Williams and the guys at Shock it was unbelievable. And we debuted the album at number 2, and we were fucking beaten by, I think it was something like Oasis, right? Like one of the biggest records of the century. And we were either that or Alanis Morissette or something that was like the pinnacle of mid-90s.
Yeah.
We got beaten by that, and we came in at number 2. And we, you know, it was Sepultura week. It was the biggest fucking thing you've ever seen. And that was, as another tangential long story, that was how I managed to later secure a deal. When I by the end of 96, I took Roadrunner out of Shock, and I signed a deal with Sony to be our distributor. And the reason why Sony gave us such a good deal was Dennis Hanlon, who was the boss at Sony, was so flabbergasted that we delivered this band he'd never heard of, Sepultura, at number 2 and went double platinum. He just was like fucking. I mean, I've got the platinum record just here hanging on my wall.
Wow.
He was like, these guys must be just rainmakers. How the hell does a little label out of a hole in the wall in Melbourne make an underground metal band like Sepultura go to number 2 in the Australian charts? And that was an unhappy I had a bit of a fallout with the guys at Shock at the time, but Dave's a mate of mine now, and it's all water under the bridge. But certainly 25 years ago, it was pretty hectic when I moved the business out of Shock, because Dave had actually, hired me effectively and recommended me to Case. But what had happened was I didn't feel like Shock had the ability to distribute the records to the level of ambition I had for the business.
Mm-hmm.
And we had, so many records that I wanted to see sort of shipping the volumes that I believed that Sony could do. And Shock just weren't able to do that at the time, I didn't think.
Really?
And,
okay.
Hence we moved to Sony.
So this is where your credibility comes in. Not only your credibility, but Roadrunner as an entity in Australia. It comes through Sony because presumably the resources in the distribution are allowing you to have a much more seasoned, refined sense of what's going to move and what's not going to move. And that informs your relationship with Roadrunner head offices and things like that.
Yeah, I mean, we had definitely, and then I moved the office. I took ourselves out of the Shock offices because I wanted to have our own identity, and we signed a lease on a separate property. Like we built it, we put an office in the heart of Melbourne in Fitzroy. Really, well, when we went in there, it was a dead street with nothing, but now it's hipster. It's ground zero of every hipster in Melbourne. So we can lay claim to the fame that we had an office on that street before anyone went there. And we were there on Gertrude Street for about 5 years. And that was, by setting up our own standalone office, Case came down and helped me with the negotiations with Shock and Sony. And then I did the deal with Sony myself, signed it myself and everything else. That was a real big step forward, because then we built up a separate, and by then it was just me and Bob, but by then we had a staff of about 6, because I'd been hiring like even everything from a bookkeeper right through to, some more promo and some other things. But even then, the early signs of some of the challenges with Case and what he wanted, were becoming apparent, that caused me and him to butt heads a lot. Was in Holland in '96, they had a giant hit with a song called I Wanna Be a Hippie by Technohead, which was a dance. They had this whole big dance movement coming out of Holland. It was called something like Gabba or something, right? It was sort of genre.
Yeah.
And Case was hell bent on us standing up a dance division and signing a dance act.
That's every satellite office had like a dance imprint. Lafayette in the UK. I think it was Burton in Holland.
Mark Palmer in the UK signed a dance act called Baby Fox that we were obliged to release. So even A&R, and they wanted, Case obliged me as well to actually hire an A&R manager for dance, which I had to do under duress because I didn't know anything about that culture and had no interest, and just went, well, how the fuck am I supposed to do this? It's like that. And it was it was just like this brand tension, right? Where I would know going into when I would go into a meeting at Sony, these people they would laugh at me when I would put a dance track on, because we were like obviously not that label, and they didn't want to do business with that. They wanted to do business with us with more Sepulturas, not some weird dance record that we thought could be a hit. So it was very hard to do that.
Is that tension, is that the productivity of Roadrunner though? If something can't get past Case, if your pitch can't get past Case, then it's not viable at all. If you as a metalhead can't sell a particular product to an opera fan, then it's not going to get signed off. Is that the strength of the brand? Is that the strength of the back office functionality?
You could say that, although I'm sure Monty and others would have views that would conflict, because, I mean, we missed some big bands like Rammstein, we missed Pantera, because those bands were just something Case didn't see at the time. And I know that, I mean, look at Pantera, look at Rammstein, right? I mean, just Goliaths that would have changed Roadrunner's fortunes long before probably, certainly long before Slipknot and Nickelback did.
Yeah.
So, but I would think that, I mean, there's a certain, I mean, look, the thing I would say, and I would, Case knows it because I love Case. He was like a sort of father figure for me, he's like just mentored me for that many years. And him and I had huge debates about it. But when I was 24, I didn't know shit, right? And he was like 50 something and I'm 50 now. And I see 24-year-olds in my company who I love and respect and think are wonderful. But when they put something to me, sometimes I look at it and go, I'm not doing that.
Mm.
And I just look at it, and I think often that feeling that I know what it feels like to be them, because I was that kid.
Yeah.
And yet I can see a little more. I've got obviously some blinkers, but I also have experience to know that that's just not. So the things that Kay said no to me on, for the most part, were the right decisions for him to make and the right decisions for the business at the time. And there's not a lot of ones that I would say we missed it and it was a disaster and I wish we had I wish we hadn't have done that. They certainly not when I was in my 20s in those early days. Later, when I was in New York, there were certain forks in the road where I made passionate pleas to Case and Jonas and the others, like almost on my knees pleas about what I felt was right for the company strategically, that was coming from a 36-year-old or a 37-year-old, not a 22 or 24-year-old. That by then, after being immersed in the business and being a senior exec in New York, I felt like I had a seat at the table. I did. I was the third in charge of the business in New York. Yeah. So I was like, felt I could say lots of stuff about that, and on deaf ears mostly.
Yeah, interesting. Was speaking more about the territory itself and speaking to the conflict, was there an isolation factor as well? Because if I'm understanding correctly, your signings, not a lot of them make international distribution, do they?
Yeah, no, none. And that was one of the problems, but probably in the end, not a problem where Roadrunner ended up. But the Case had obviously aspirations for us to have all these local bands, and that there would one day be that this would be a great source of additional repertoire, so it wasn't all reliant on New York and the signings out of there. But in actual fact, it was a classic case of Case having certainly the right strategy, and it was a good idea, but the infrastructure to support that wasn't there. So Monty and the others were still absolute gatekeepers. And again, not blaming, it was fine, right? They would just look, what the fuck is this? I'm not putting out some garbage, shitty band from Melbourne or Sydney. Why would I do that, right? I've got 50 other records coming my way from my signings and all these other demos and that. I'm not going to worry about that. Or they'd say rightly, well, John, you come and see us when you've sold 20,000 records.
Right.
And even then, because again, in those days, the markets weren't, the understanding of the Australian market wasn't such that if I sold 20,000 records, that would be a massive amount of records, because a gold album is 35. Mm-hmm. So if I had gone to New York and said, well, I did sell 20,000 and that's like selling 300,000, they would go, nah, you just sold 20,000.
Right.
So so it was really, there was a lot of gatekeeping, and I don't resent it. And I, in fact, for the most part, probably think it was, for some of the stuff, a very good idea. But what was the problem was Case wanted all this international repertoire to thrive, and there wasn't a lot of ability to sort of advocate for that internationally, or to, and as you can imagine culturally, I mean, if Case just sort of bent people's arms and said to, New York, I don't give a shit, you're releasing John's album, good luck with that, right? Like, what kind of treatment is that record going to get? It's going to get nothing. And and I think that's always the case with a record company, where it's about people's tastes and subjective view, that you're just going to have a lot of gatekeepers. And I think that's probably for a good reason. And I think there's almost an inherent challenge, or almost an impossible challenge, unless the territory in question can deliver a hit on a plate, to ask another territory to try and break your band for you. Mm-hmm. It's ridiculous. And it took me a few years to absorb that fact, but I absolutely believe it. So I've got no hard feelings that my records didn't ever get released.
I think this is it's a very indie circumstance as well. There's proximity, there's politics, and there's simply working hours, isn't there? You got 40 working hours in a week conventionally by contract, but you're probably working 60. And most of those are going to be backed by you're going to be backing bands which you're absolutely passionate about and came across your desks. So if something lands in from, return address is in Melbourne, it's going to be difficult to ascertain the backing. Yeah. And so I might have been pissed off when I was younger, and I thought that I was a genius, A&R genius,
But in all the bands that I signed over 12 years in Australia, only one went gold.
Mm-hmm.
Which one was most of Behind Crimson Eyes,
right?
Which was the last band that I signed, and that was very successful. But outside of that, most of the bands, and a lot of them I love, some of them just broke up. I mean, NIL and Effigy could have. I'm certain if they hadn't have just exploded, they could, imploded. They would have exploded.
Declan did all right.
They had the right chemistry.
Yeah, Declan did all right from NIL.
He's going to great. He's killing
it. Yeah. Writing on the Witcher, doing all sorts of stuff. Yeah, it's crazy.
He's a remarkable talent. And I had my I had my 50th birthday party a week ago or a week and a bit ago here in Melbourne, just before the lockdown hit, and I had Andy from NIL get up and guest on guitar and do War Pigs, do lead guitar on War Pigs, and I had Pete from Effigy get up and sing some songs. So, yeah, it was great to see those guys and still kicking ass. And I had another band of mine, Elephant Gun, that I signed to Roadrunner, that came in, and Todd is an amazing singer, got up and sang some songs. So all the guys are there, and it was all good fun. And,
should record it. A Roadrunner Australia reunited. That's a bootleg, isn't it?
Yeah, maybe for my 50. I don't know how. It's all fun nostalgia, but it was good to see all those guys and remembering that there was a lot of talent. Right, it was just a hard market, and the conditions in Australia were very difficult for Roadrunner to break bands because we had an okay relationship with Triple J in the 90s, but then in the 2000s when Richard Kingsmill took over as the programming director at Triple J, it all just went to shit. I mean, we couldn't get records on. He didn't like metal. Don't think he liked me much. And and I didn't like Triple J, and I didn't like their ethos, and I didn't like much at all about it. And so we sort of had this very challenging relationship where we couldn't get a lot of records on, and that was troubling and hard. All the publications died. So what I did was I set up a website called metalshop.com.au in 2000 that became for a couple of years the biggest metal website on the planet.
Wow.
It was massive. And we set up a MySpace type thing before MySpace existed called The Beast, where people could sign up and put their demos and their band profile up. And we had 100,000 bands put their profiles up.
Did it have a European?
No, it didn't. What happened was it became a victim of its own success. And in those days, before there was Amazon and everything, the server bills were running at $10,000 a month, and Case it wasn't making any money because it was really just a marketing. It wasn't selling anything. There was no ad business.
Yeah.
So we were obliged to close it, which was a heartbreaking thing.
I swear I got my whacking open air tickets from metalshop.de, obviously being Deutschland.
Yeah,
so that's why.
Yeah. But Metal Shop was massive, and we ran that for about 4 years. And we did a lot of web and digital marketing in those early days, which is how I got good at digital and new media and whatever. So we were forced to, because there was just no channels to market our records. All the papers died, all the mags died. Yep. No radio would play us apart from the specialist shows.
Yep.
So everything we ever released, we had to kind of market on our own. And that made us, as a team, I think it made us exceptionally good marketers. I mean, I think that the team we had in the 2000s, before I left for New York, were just unbelievably good at marketing music because we got no favors and no help from anyone.
Evolution through struggle. Yeah.
Yeah, it was.
Yeah, that's great. It's so crazy. You know what? You were one of the first names that I put on my list to have a chat with, but I was like, I feel like I need to school myself a bit first. But I'm actually glad I just went in to both feet, because it's so interesting to understand how different Australia is to the rest of the world. And you wouldn't have thought it, because you think Roadrunner a very reliable brand worldwide. It's like, well, it's not as simple as what you see when you look at it in terms of a New York operation, and it's as big as it could possibly be. It's like, it's different everywhere. With that in mind, did I read somewhere you had either a relationship or you worked with Japan on some things? There was a territory, an Eastern territory.
No, I looked after Southeast Asia for about 5 years.
Right.
So not Japan, but for all of Southeast Asia. So Thailand and Korea and Philippines, those markets. And so I would go over in Hong Kong, Singapore, and we were trying to set up little micro label sort of presences in those markets. Obviously not standalones, but just building up the Roadrunner presence within the Sony. Usually I think it was mostly Sony who were our distributors across Asia. And then just, trying to get profile for the artists. And certainly in the early 2000s, it was mostly around getting more, we knew that Nickelback should be getting more coverage, and it did. And we got some big gold records and stuff in those territories. But even then, piracy was really starting to crunch the businesses in Asia. I mean, those minor territories like your Indonesias and your Philippines and Thailand were just getting murdered by piracy in the early 2000s. It was all the Kazars and, Napsters and all this sort of shit and whatever Asian variants there were of that. So it was always pushing shit uphill basically in those territories. So that was my relationship with Asia. Case sort of commissioned me to do that for about 5 years, which was interesting. And New Zealand was part of my remit as well. Universal was our distributor in New Zealand. We got some really great runs on the board there with, it was obviously the big ones. When Slipknot hit in 99, 2000, then the world changed for Roadrunner materially, because there was a patch in 98 where things were looking pretty fucking grim. I mean, I think one year I was looking at our release schedule going, I think the best record we've got this year is Coal Chamber.
Yeah.
And I mean, that's telling you something, right? If your hero album for the year is Coal Chamber, it's not looking great. And Case had also made probably, I don't know whether, you call it a strategic mistake or sort of a little juncture where Roadrunner bought a label in Holland called Arcade Music and tried to rename the company RAM, which all of us just refused to do. I mean, we kept getting these memos from Holland going, we need to see RAM on your this and that. I was like, fuck no, I'm not doing that, right? Which showed sort of the power of the territories. We would just say, I'm not doing it. And I think I said to Case once, we're just not doing it, Case. If you wanted that to happen, then you may not have a company here, because we just drop the tools, because we're just not doing that. Mm-hmm. No one wants to call this Roadrunner Arcade Music or RAM. And then they were sending repertoire our way like Dutch pop singers and Schlager, which was like this Dutch sort of drinking songs, and fucking, a kid's pop thing called Bubbles. Mm-hmm. And, we're just looking and going, what the fuck is this? And RAM, what is this? And it was just a mess. And sure enough, I think it really hurt the business for a bit. And then when Slipknot came, it kind of washed all those sins away, right? We've been fumbling around, and there've been some repertoire mistakes and some strategic errors, and then Slipknot exploded, and holy shit, right? 2000 was a monster year. Yeah. Because we had the biggest metal band on the planet, and that Slipknot record just went like triple platinum in Australia or something mad. And then we put out a VHS and a DVD that went like platinum. It was just, fuck, this is like, I remember you were doing 10,000 Slipknot albums a week. This is crazy.
Was it like Roots all over again?
Bigger than Roots.
Yeah.
Because Roots sold to a sort of receipt. What Roots was like the culmination of a band's career, because Chaos AD and Arise and those records had sort of built the band up, and then Roots was kind of like the cherry on top. Whereas what Slipknot was just this fucking huge tidal wave of, and then they toured February 2000, which was still one of the most insane tours and the most crazy shows I've ever been to. And we did in-stores where we had like riots and 5,000 kids trashing the record store. I mean, it was freaking I still have PTSD about that stuff. And Slipknot was like, just changed the whole the nature of it. So Australia became one of the biggest territories for Slipknot. We sold just truckloads of it. The band toured a lot. And then Nickelback happened a year later. And then we were the first country in the world to go platinum with How You Remind Me. And we had the band touring Australia in September, just a week after September 11.
Yep.
2 weeks after, they were in Australia before the whole record had exploded in the States. Mm-hmm. And so we delivered a platinum record and a platinum single before the US went platinum. So we were the first country to break Nickelback, and then that record just went berserk. And then Nickelback for the next 6 years in Australia was just gargantuan.
It's interesting because like the Nickelback I see as the culmination of that. You know, you talk about the '98 period being reminiscent of, you have your flagship acts, and then these things underneath it are trying to break through, like your alternatives, like your Blue Mountains, Moon Seven Times, things like that. Nickelback was the logical conclusion of that, I think, because that's where Roadrunner did what it tried to do, which was we want to have like a more of a contemporary rock flagship. That's what Nickelback was. And Slipknot was a metal outlier, which was somehow just culturally penetrative and just took everything away. So when you have those two giant flagships in Australia, is the dynamic shifted so much? Because obviously you already had like Sony being interested from the Roots, for the credibility of Roots, but now is it like, okay, if there's a year where Slipknot or Nickelback don't put a record out, it's going to look shit?
Well, by then we were distributed by Universal like we moved from Sony to Universal actually over the course of that
arcade stuff.
Arcade was Sony period. It was 2001, 2002 when we moved over to Universal, because Case had sold part of the business to IDJ. And we moved to Universal, and they sort of picked up the slack, or not, it was not slack, they just picked up the ball and kept running with the Nickelback record and Silver Side Up, that was. And then we just kept going with Universal for about, well, it would be 5 years, and then we moved to Warner. Just before I went to the US, we had to move to Warner because of the Warner deal. Universal were awesome, and they just, then we did the follow-up to Silver Side Up. I'm going to forget all the names.
Long Road.
Long Road, right. And then that was gargantuan. And then we did All the Right Reasons, which was just had to get 3 records in a row that were just so massive. We went 5 times platinum with All the Right Reasons. And, and How You Remind Me ended up being the third, at the time, I don't know if it's still the case, the third highest selling single in Australian history. So, I mean, we did 214,000 physical CD singles. It's just, in Australia, it's just hard to, I tell the kids these days, I mean, they don't even know what a CD single is, but I say to some of my staff at Fortress now, who are record company kids who've come out of the music industry, and just, they don't, just like, can you imagine people paying $5 for a CD single? We sold 210,000 of them. It's just beggars belief, but that's just how big it was. It was so big. And I love the Nickelback guys, and they supported Australian market, and they did anything we wanted. They would, they always came here. They would do phoners. They just loved it. And, became really good friends with them, and they just did whatever we asked. It was so awesome. And I never, people often tease me about, John, you broke Nickelback in Australia and and Nickelback, because it become, obviously for some, they were always a bit of a joke. And I said, well, the one benchmark with Nickelback was the day the hipsters stop hating Nickelback is the day the business is done. So that the more hate, the more we could just take it to the bank, baby. I just love the hate. And I used to like the records, and I liked the band, and I liked the whole thing. And I was just like, just the hostility we got from the Triple J world was wonderful. And it was just, it was personally the vindication that Nickelback gave all of us, because it spoke so much to the ethos that in Australia we built as a company, which we really did thrive. By this stage, we had a team of about 14 in Melbourne, so we grew the business quite nicely, and we had a really powerful ethos of us versus them. And I know that that's a cheap and pretty hackneyed sort of
it's a metal ethos
ideology, but it was an ethos, and it was one that we really fostered about, like, no one likes our music. All the cool people think that our shit's no good. No one likes metal. Everyone hates Nickelback, and fuck yous all, because we're selling truckloads of it to the kids, and we used to love that. And it was so, we would just really embrace it and love it, that lots of our bands people didn't like. It was wonderful. I still love it.
That speaks to the legacy of the label massively, because it's not. I don't think it's a cheap, tacky ethos us versus them, because the game's rigged. The game's fucking rigged. So when you sell somewhere that people fucking hate, power to you. You know what I mean?
It was so good, yeah, and it was really nice. And so, and then you'd go to a concert and it'd be, 15,000 people in Sydney or Melbourne singing every Nickelback song. You go, here you go. This is like, clearly the haters are wrong, right?
Yeah.
It was really good. So, and it just afforded, what happened then, of course, it just allowed those successes. We never lost the indie, certainly in Australia before I went to New York, we never lost that independent spirit. We just stayed, we had our own office. We just kept doing our own thing. We used to host parties in our garage downstairs. We used to do after parties. One day we had, after Slayer toured with Machine Head in, I think it was 2004, we had a mighty party where Kerry King came afterwards and the Machine Head guys, and we were doing shots of vodka with them. It was just fucking huge, right? We used to do stuff like that. Killswitch Engage guys came. We used to do all this stuff. It was great. And bands, what it meant was bands like Killswitch and those bands that were more up-and-comers, or that we really had an affection for, we now had more money and more wherewithal to get the message out about those bands.
Yeah.
It was really nice, and then not to have to put a marketing plan together for $3,000. You could have a swing for the fences with some bands. You could go let's really back this one. And that didn't always pay off, but that's the music industry, right? One of them would, and Killswitch was a great example of a band that really did, build themselves up out of an underground scene, and then End of Heartache was humongous.
Yeah, absolutely. What were you feeling when the IDJ deal came in? Were you thinking, oh, fuck, here we go?
Yeah, well, Case rang me, and I remember I was just sitting in my garden one afternoon, and he rang me from Holland. He was like, oh, John, I just got to tell you something about that. And I was like, oh, man, and now I've got to move from Sony to Universal. Just when Nickelback was exploding, it was a bit challenging. And then it was probably worse was when he then did the deal with Warner, because then we spent 4 or 5 great years with Universal, and I've still got lots of good friends there, and they did a fantastic job. And then it was like, oh, now we have to move from Sony, then Universal, then Warner. And it was starting to get, even then, fortunately, the original Warner deal wasn't one that encroached on our freedom. And it wasn't until the last 2 years in New York when Warner bought out the whole thing pretty much.
The axe started to drop.
Yeah, and the world changed, and suddenly HR guys from Warner are wandering around, and, the whole thing changed. The whole culture changed, yeah.
How are you doing for time? I've taken up way a lot.
No, I'm good, mate. I can keep tracking along.
Perfect. Who signed Airborne? Was it Berman?
Yes. Well, they were signed in Australia by a local label, and then Major. He signed the rights outside of ANZ.
That's how it happened. Then it wasn't. It slipped through your fingers. It was already an entity, already part of another entity, and that's how it got picked up. Yeah. Right. That makes sense. So let's talk about how you migrated into a digital role, which is obviously your bag now. So it was quite well. You clearly got stuck in that world, having been doing it for effectively 16 years under multiple disciplines.
Yeah. Well, basically, like I said before, it was just out of necessity. We had all the channels to market were drying up, all the ways to promote the records, except for the internet, which was one thing that we could do. Now, the thing that, well, probably the genesis of everything, the genesis of my whole career, of the biggest marketing insight I ever had, which proved to be a phenomenal one, really, in the end, was when I started at Roadrunner in 95 and 96. It was shocking to me that we were selling, hundreds of thousands of CDs a year and not having any way to contact the person who bought that CD.
Okay.
And the first thing I did, really, even for the Roots record, I remember it was the first one we did. I insisted that every Roadrunner album that we ever released had to have a blow-in card. Mm-hmm. Like a card with a mailing address to send back to us.
Yep.
And because we didn't have much money, I couldn't even afford postage paid. It even obliged the person to stick a stamp on it. Mm-hmm. And in those days, no email, right? It was a physical mailing address, and you mailed us your physical home address. And within a year, we'd collected over 20,000 cards. Mm-hmm. And I would go to the mailing box, the PO box, once a week and just pick up a huge pallet of blow-in cards. Mm-hmm. And I knew that we were onto something. It's like, holy shit, this is something incredible here. We're building a direct line to the fans.
Mm-hmm.
And I had to hire like a kid just 3 days a week to do data entry, because in those days it was just going through piles of cards and typing in their addresses into a primitive Excel, like a primitive spreadsheet. And that we never stopped doing that. And when the Slipknot record released, one day I remember going to the PO box about 3 weeks after Slipknot exploded, and there was like, it was like a sitcom where I opened the PO box and it just like fell, this giant pile of cards fell on me, and there was fucking pallets of them. The guy at the post office said he knew me. He's like, John, you better come around here. And he opened a door, and it was like boxes of them. They just did like 30,000 cards in like a week and a half.
Wow.
And I was like, fuck, we really have got something serious going on here.
Yeah.
And we ended up just getting them all in, and we had a huge, even like then, 99, 2000, we had a database of 30, 40, 50,000. And then another watershed was Sony, to their credit, when we did the deal, when we had only 20,000, Sony agreed to commemorate the deal with Roadrunner. They funded a sampler CD. This is 96, right? Years before there was internet and free music. Mm-hmm. And we did a free CD of all the big hits of the year, like all the Roadrunner sort of forthcoming release singles. Mm-hmm. And we mailed it to 20,000 people.
Fuck.
In the mail.
Yeah.
So in the mail, you're a Roadrunner fan, you got a CD in the mail. And it blew
all on Sony's dime?
All on Sony's dime.
That just speaks to the credibility, doesn't it?
It was so awesome. And it blew people's minds. They were just like, because that just didn't happen in those days. It was just like, wow. And our reputation as a label, just, the word of mouth reputation of just what Roadrunner was capable of, and our affection for the fans. Mm-hmm. And then we just built up a database, and we used to mail people newsletters, physical, like fanzine type things.
Yeah.
And then we set up I'm on a tangent about digital, but it was sort of the genesis.
I'm all about how they innovated. I'm all about how Roadrunner innovated, and this is like gold.
Well, then we created our own magazine, because I just said, well, fuck this. There's no more metal mags, and we need one. So we created a magazine called Outsider Magazine, and we published that for 3 or 4 years, or maybe even 5 years, like once a quarter. And we did that, and then we did a yearly catalog campaign where we put a fat catalog with reviews of every, because no one's giving us reviews. Fuck them. Let's make our own review magazine. And we reviewed every single title in a catalog that was like a 36 or 48 page glossy thick catalog. Mm-hmm. Mail it to everybody. Mm-hmm. Mail it to we used to spend like 50 grand on, annual catalog campaign, and we would sell 120,000 catalog albums in a year.
Wow.
So it was just so effective. And this was all the sort of genesis of this understanding that digital is really just a means to connect directly with your audience, right? And that was the key insight that I had, was like, we can't rely on these third-party media. They don't like us. It's the us versus them. No one wants to write about us. No one likes our shit. Mm-hmm. So let's make our own shit. And so make a mag, make a catalog so we can review our own records. And then let's set up a website. So then there was Metal Shop. Let's build a database. And we used to use a program called Goldmine just to do sort of crude CRM and emails. And then it was, let's set up an email program. And then let's set up a MySpace page when that started. And it kept growing. And then we just out of necessity and out of curiosity and a willingness to try anything, I got pretty good at sort of, well, it wouldn't be digital. It was probably just direct marketing, just understanding the need to bypass the gatekeepers and the traditional channels and go rogue and do your own thing. And we would sell our own. We used to print Roadrunner T-shirts with our logos and sell shitloads of them, because the label and the brand had such powerful brand equity. We would sell 1,000 Roadrunner T-shirts a year at $30 a pop. And it was like, keep selling baseball caps, all that stuff. So then when in 2007, I think it was about March or April, I was in New York for a company conference, and they had set an exercise, when you're on a retreat, everyone's away, and then they set up a company exercise for us to break up into groups of 10 or 20 and to do a project where we had to present back to the group that night with it was like a digital marketing project. Like, how would you sell a record to if someone was walking past you in the street? I don't even remember what it was. And I'd also just finished my MBA. I did an MBA to try and improve my business skills for 3 years, between 2003 and 2006. So I got pretty good at strategy and some digital stuff that I did in the MBA, some formal business training. So then I did this. I remember being in this group at this retreat and basically commanding, basically owning the project and doing the deck myself and then presenting it to the team and winning. And Case just coming up to me at the end of the night and going, John, you're needed in New York. I need you here within 3 months. Are you good? And I was like, oh fuck, yeah, maybe. Better talk to the missus about that. And she agreed. And then by September, we'd moved to New York.
As if. That's fucking meant. You know what's really weird? Marcus Turner sent me a picture of that very retreat yesterday.
Oh, did he?
Yeah. Yeah, I'll forward it on to you.
Yeah, that'd be great. Well, Marcus is he's one of my best mates in the company. So he's a colossal fella.
Yeah. I just put up the episode with him when he talks about the arcade stuff in quite a lot of detail. It's very interesting because obviously part of the project is trying to track the history of the label, as you might imagine, and seeing the dominoes, which dominoes are the ones which start the Warner acquisition. It's interesting because he gets half of that.
Marcus would have hated that arcade stuff, I would imagine. It was just such poor brand management.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of the appeal of the arcade stuff was the territories because they had offices everywhere, and if you own the offices, you have a foothold in this smaller, lesser known territories, and I think that was partially the idea. But at the same time, they were a pop compilation company, which is where Case was like, great, we can put some more revenue on the back burner to keep the lights on in case Nickelback split up,
Yeah, well, it was that. I mean, yes, the heart was in the right place, but it was just a poor brand. It was a poor brand strategy. It was just not. It just the implementation, like we used to call them opcos. That was what Australia was, and what all the non-Holland businesses, we all called them opcos. And so all the opcos were just like, not doing it. And so the implementation just was dreadful.
Yeah. There are some adverts in the trades, I think, mostly in Billboard, where they do say Roadrunner Arcade, and it's rare. I will give you that. When I'm doing the research, it's rare to see it.
It is rare.
Right. So, as we move into your role into the new media, its title's new media, but we call it effectively digital and otherworldly things. What kind of innovations did sprung up there? So, this is the post 2007. This is in role.
Yeah.
Tell me about what happened there, because we're entering the digital revolution and the higher piracy now, aren't we?
Yeah. So I came in as Senior VP of New Media and Global Business Development was my formal title. And there was not really a clear remit, but it was sort of it reminded me a bit like day one at Roadrunner and Shock Records. Like, here's a box, go and, it was like, that's your title, John, be the new media guy. And it was a bit it was quite intimidating because, I knew a bit about the American market, but of course I just, I was a fish out of water, and I've been to New York plenty of times, and I sort of had a reasonable understanding of the culture and everything, but I just not, of course, lived there. And it was a soft landing, and because I'd been 12 years in the business and knew everybody, it wasn't like, who's this weird new guy with an Aussie accent walking around. That, like, nearly everybody knew who I was, and I came with a fairly, a good reputation, right? I hadn't made any enemies or anything. In fact, everyone was very pleased to see me. So it was quite a good, it was probably the best possible reception you could get, because people were like, oh, it's great you're here, mate. Let's make magic together. So that was really nice, and I always felt really welcome. And I often think back about that and think that I wish that Australians could emulate sometimes the kind of level of warmth and welcoming that I know the Americans gave me, because they're a lot nicer at times than Aussies can be, I think, at times, about some of this shit. But that's a side story. Anyway, the New York office kind of said to me, just run digital, run new media, and sort out our shit. And the first thing I did as a major decision, a bit, again, sort of following on from my thing earlier I said about the need for a better direct relationship with the fans, was I just took one look at the email situation, and it was an absolute disaster. They were basically sending emails using like Excel spreadsheets and Outlook. And it was so bad. I just was horrified. And in those days, it just was Wild West too. There was just not a lot of rules and regulations about that stuff that you have now. And so it was just like, oh, can you email me the list? And someone's just got an attached fucking list with 20,000 people. It's just an absolute mess. And I just thought that's the quintessential sort of low-hanging fruit, all the cliches, the quick wins, the low-hanging fruits, all that bullshit. So I went, at least if I can wrestle this email thing down and show the business here that this is how important email marketing is, and cleaning up this data. And I remember Doug Keogh and a few of the guys would often trumpet how big their database was. You know, like, we have 900,000, I don't remember the number was, but it was just a huge number. And they used to say on their marketing materials, and Madeline and some of the other marketers, the heads of marketing, that would say on their one sheets, 900,000 marketing emails and blah, blah. And I remember after doing a cleansing activity on the email list and using a professional company to do like an audit, it was like it was down to like from 900, again, I don't remember this, but something so extraordinary, like 900 to something like 87,000. And
like active users or active emails.
Of real people, of like email addresses that were still alive and attached to a human being.
Yeah.
And I remember going into one of my first sort of, work in progress meetings and going, oh, I got some good news and bad news, right? Good news, we fixed the email list. Bad news, it's 1/10 of the size that it used to be. And it was like up in, what the fuck, John? What are you talking about? And I was like, well, we've got to just start from scratch, because we've got 10 years of accumulated junk and no one's ever cleaned it. And it's just, but from there, I mean, Case and everyone said, all right, John, well, fuck, we trust you. So I remember just almost like a fateful day, just pushing this sort of eject button on like 800,000 emails and taking that responsibility, but saying we have to start from scratch and build this properly with clean data and clean email. And we did by, it was a big momentum to. I managed to get, we moved the business. We used Exact Target, which later became Salesforce. I did a deal with Exact Target to do all of the email marketing, and we really matured and created a sophisticated email marketing program for Roadrunner, which I was pretty proud of, and that was really good. And we built it up over the 5 years I was there to, many hundreds of thousands, and then we developed a Facebook page, and and those MySpace was still big then too. So we just did that. But the big thing that I was the most proud of, but it took one failed attempt to do it right, was I set up a website in about my third year called signmetoroadrunnerrecords.com. Right. And it was a A&R, it was like a public-facing A&R portal. And it was, again, a bit like the beast about Metal Shop. It was like Metal Shop 2.0, again, where the idea was that people could submit their demos, and then the public would be crowdsourcing the ratings of it. And our A&R guys would have a console on the back to see what the best highly rated music of the day was, and all these we created all these charts. And we got about 90,000 bands within a 6-month period signing up to this, and even some really good bands that surfaced. And but it was, again, another one of those classics where it was a remarkable product, and it got huge viewership, and it got a lot of attention, but didn't get a lot of buy-in. And from the A&R guys, they just didn't dig it that much. It was
they don't want fucking telling what band is good, do they?
It wasn't. And so it was the right solution for the wrong problem, or the wrong solution to the right problem. I don't know. It was a lot of things I've done in my life have sort of been a little too, not to blow my own smoke, but just a bit more, probably too far ahead of where the market was. And then later, if I only thought of it later, not earlier, it might have been a better time, because it was probably a little premature where the world was in 2009, 2010. Whereas nowadays, it's just be like de rigueur to think that that's normal, right? And so we made this and got tens of thousands of bands signing up. And it was obviously a heartbreaking thing when Warner, when we got the bullet, they just shut that down too. So that was a shocker. but because a heap of effort went into that. And I still think that's, if someone said, John, in your whole life, your whole career, what's one of the, what's some of the highlights of things you've ever done? I would say that Sign Me To website was an absolute fucking cracker of a site and a really good idea, and it would have had a lot of promise, and if it had been supported, if it kept going, I think it would be a phenomenon now. Again, I think that others might disagree, but what I did was really a lot of housekeeping and hygiene in the first couple of years, just to get the fundamentals in order that were really in quite a bad shape. We redid the website too. We completely revamped the Roadrunner Records site, and just basic hygiene, just to get
mobilizing for the digital age,
modernized. And those were days when giving away a CD single like as a download for free would just have everybody like hand wringing for days on end whether we should give a single away as a free download. And even I would think that. And then there's lots of piracy stuff that it wasn't as clear to us how formidable piracy was, although it was killing us. We weren't aware of how the magnitude of it really was.
Sure.
And ringtones was massive. I mean, these are all nostalgia things. Guitar Hero was freaking massive. Dragon Force wouldn't exist without Guitar Hero, right? Yeah. I mean, it was just all of those things were great, and all underpinning it was just extraordinary business we were doing with Nickelback with all the right reasons. In 2007, 2008, just kept selling and selling and selling. So Roadrunner US was an awesome experience for me because I'd never been living overseas before. I'd never experienced that sort of thrown in the deep end into a somewhat alien culture and fend for yourself. And it was a extraordinary trial by fire to get through to the other side. It was just such a shame in a way that it ended sort of quite abruptly, but at least when it ended, it was sort of with other compadres, right? It wasn't the shame of walking the aisle with a box and everyone not looking your way. It was much more of a case that we all, a lot of us got whacked, and we all just went down the pub that night and kind of all knew we all sort of saw the writing on the wall for the last 6 months.
Yeah.
And so, that to come back full circle about, we were saying earlier around the brand and the issues, it was really that last couple of years where I felt that the company was really going off, needed to be correct course. And the deal we did with, and again, none of this is resenting in the sense of like the people involved. I think they were marvelous people and I liked them and there was no hard feelings, but more just from business and from strategy and from brand. I just thought the deal we did with Loud and Proud didn't dig that one bit. I thought that was just what we got into the mode of doing was just, we just thought the best use of funds from Nickelback was trying to find more Nickelbacks. And I thought that was a dreadful approach, and that what we should have done, and I wrote papers to Case and to others, I wrote strategy memos and I begged them, I said, with all of this money we've got, we should buy Century Media and we should buy Nuclear Blast and we should buy every fucking metal label that exists and create this just absolute unstoppable one-stop metal brand that's Roadrunner of all the Spine Farm. Before they were all bought by the majors, which they ended up being bought by the majors, I kept saying, we should buy Century Media. We should buy Nuclear Blast. We should buy the Napalm Records. We should buy them.
That's fascinating.
We should buy Rise Above. We should just use our Nickelback money and double down on metal, not use the Nickelback money on trying to find more Nickelbacks, because Nickelback is a once-a-lifetime lightning in a bottle. There's a string of dead Nickelbacks every major label can afford. They can afford to die on a cross to find more Nickelbacks because they can lose more money than we can. But we should consolidate our brand as the definitive hard rock and metal label and use all of this money to create this legacy of metal that can see us through for 20 more years. Yeah, and I was begging them to do that, and I don't know who you speak to, but I would say, I would do it in meetings. I would say, give them memos. I remember being thrown out of a meeting. We had a listening session with all the executives, the head of Mark, Jonas, Madeline, all the bosses were there, Harlan in New York. And for me, the nadir of the company and the worst thing we ever did was the Lenny Kravitz record. That to me was the absolute depths of plumbing the depths of music and of taste and of everything. And everything that I had started for, in 1995 when I started at Roadrunner, the idea then that we would release a Lenny Kravitz record, which was the kind of antithesis of sort of the ethos and the whole thing, this kind of what I thought was just this kind of horrible funk-like rock wannabe poser, just can't bear it, right? The music's horrible. And this record just got played, and I remember hearing the first single and Case going around the room like, what do you think? And I said, this is just horrible, Case. This is just a disaster. And him going, get out, and kicking me out of the room.
Gee, it was on the death threat for you then.
Oh, but everyone was just silent, staring at their shoes, and I just thought, I can't let, I've been here 16 years. I cannot sit here and let this label that I worship and love and, likes my life being killed by this kind of mediocrity, these releases, right? And that Lenny Kravitz record sold nothing. They spent a fortune on it, like I think more than $1 million, and I think it scanned like 7,000 records or something. I mean, it was an absolute insane bomb. And then, we put out a garbage Queensryche record, which was trash. And I fucking loved Queensryche in the 80s. But then this record was garbage. And then we put out a Sammy Hagar record that was crap. And we just kept putting out these kind of a Meatloaf record, for Christ's sakes. I mean, we're just putting out like all this garbage in the last 6 months to a year that just had no affinity and no connection to the brand, and was wasting time, effort, and resources in this mad trying to dash to try to fill the gaps and fill the holes, which by then it was largely too late, because what we should have been doing 4 or 5 years earlier was banking all that Nickelback money and even some of the Slipknot and other money, and saying, you know what, Nickelback was like a one-off chance to get this giant success. Let's now go back to the roots of the business, not underground death metal finding more obituaries. Let's just get all the metal labels that exist and all the rock and hard rock and just be that label for the world and be happy with that.
Mm-hmm. That's mad.
And that's what
it's so crazy, dude, because so many people have different perspectives on the downward trajectory. And I've heard many stories which I won't repeat because they're strictly off record, unfortunately. But tell me about this. All this stuff was all on Loud and Proud, right?
The majority of. I mean, I don't know. I think a lot of it was. I think Lenny was, Sammy was, Meatloaf was. There
was a design like arm for legacy acts, which was going to be pushed through Loud and Proud, which I think was Warner and Roadrunner at the same time. This is the run-up. This is it. This is where, in my research for it, this is where the latches are in now from Warner. And no longer is this like the Universal arrangement where Universal say, we want Slipknot, we want Nickelback, and we'll let you do everything else, Roadrunner. It's a complete departure.
I don't know if Warner, again, I wouldn't know the full history of how much influence. I know Lior was definitely involved in like the Lenny stuff. Lior was definitely, had his finger in the pie and was, and then we signed Young the Giant, which Ron Berman, who's one of my best mates, signed, and he found them, and then we had another young guy come in as the A&R guy, and we had guys from Warner's like Mike Easterlin, who's still there, coming in, and so it felt like there were these sort of Warner cats who kind of were coming in from the sides, and there was perhaps some surveillance going on. I mean, paranoia perhaps, but there was perhaps conversations that were happening inside the inner sanctum, perhaps were leaving the inner sanctum, one might think. And the Loud and Proud did. It wasn't, they were putting these records out, and it may be that they were doing the lion's share of the A&R and all that, but what was happening was it's just taking up a lot of oxygen. Yeah, taking up a lot of space that could have been used on building the brand and the business in more productive ways. And so we were diverting energy and resources to doing that stuff when we should have been even putting out like we did a Korn deal. Now Korn's good, and that, you know, the Korn record was okay, but we were fine. What we were trying to do was just fill the gaps with heritage and older acts, and not like saying, well, let's find these labels that have got great track records, like the Spine Time, Century Medias, and rock labels that exist, and get them and grab them. And build on their A&R, that they've got like tons of metal and rock going on in their world too, and be the best of all of that, because the brand, no matter what the bosses felt, the punters were speaking, and that was, they still thought Roadrunner was a rock and metal label.
Yeah.
And anything we ever tried just really didn't work to try to deviate from that. That's, our brand was just branded into us like a brand.
Yeah.
And that's what we were. And that's how we were known. And so really we should have been focusing our energies on that. But by the time that last year or so, when the wheels were falling off happened, it was too late, right? You couldn't, it was because A&R takes 4 or 5 years sometimes to bear fruit. And so we were in a horrible position where we were trying to just buy acts off the shelf to fill the gap. So it was no real, I'm not certainly wanting to be negative about Loud and Proud and whatever they were doing or any of these other things. It was more just where I felt it was about what we should have been doing, not whether those acts or that stuff. Although, yeah, Lenny, I definitely believe that the record that was handed in was unlistenable and just horrible. So it was also, that was one where I feel like the music absolutely was just not up to snuff.
Yep.
But outside of that, I felt like we were just heading in the wrong direction for a while, and it was too late. By the time it kind of Warner's wrapped it up in many ways, it was sort of too late. It was too late to sort of do a U-turn or course correct. We should have been course correcting 06, 07, 08, when we were really banking the big Nickelback money.
That, and from my perspective, when I was a wee nipper, that was like Trivium and Killswitch era, Devil Drivers coming in. We were getting like a new breed, and it felt like it was going to last forever. And some of those bands are still definitely going strong, but it didn't. How do I put this? The trajectory of those bands and that kind of music didn't play into Roadrunner's core. It went off, and that gent happened, tech metal happened, conventional metalcore happened, and it happened outside of Roadrunner's watch when it shouldn't have done.
Right. And then, you know, the whole resurgence of power metal and like all the Swedish metal that was coming out and all those awesome, Ghost, right? Rise Above signed Ghost, and then they went to Universal. We missed them. We tried to sign Ghost. And just we should have, if we'd had been more on the ball in that mid period of the early to mid 2000s when we were banking, we would have probably captured more of those bands, right? We would have, if we had the whole, not just that, but if Case and others had said, yes, we will adopt this strategy and we won't look for more Nickelbacks, we'll accept Nickelback as a one-off, and we'll build this business again. But I think that, you know, again, it's not a criticism of Case. It's his company, right? And he wanted to do what he wanted to do. And I can sound like a bit annoyed or pissed off, but it was more just, it was sort of how it ended. Like, I sort of figured that if we had found, I mean, of course, the history would be different if we had found more Nickelbacks. We had Theory of a Dead Man did okay, but lots of money was spent on that band, and, you know, probably never rose to the heights of Nickelback, of course. And we had some others, but nothing got close to Nickelback. So, but if we had found 1 or 2 more Nickelbacks, it'd be a different story. It'd be saying, fuck, everyone, was just a wonderful strategy. How good's that? But as it ended up, it just kind of ended up, you know, sort of where it all got sort of wrapped up. And now I guess it's just it's a label, it's a paint, it's a sign on a wall in a Warner office, right? So, and it doesn't exist like it did 20 years. Now, whether independent labels can still exist like they did 20 years ago is another moot point, right? Is there a world that indie labels, some could argue they can, because there are independent labels still thriving and getting on with business. Whether it would ever have been at the scale and ambition that, say, Case would have wanted is different. Yeah.
And that's why it's so special. Because imagine the trajectory if it didn't. Imagine in that period at the hot point in 2001, let's say Nickelback came out 6 months earlier, Silver Side Up comes out, goes 5 times platinum or 10 times in the States. There's no need for an investment from IDJ. you're still at Roadrunner going to metal gigs every night.
Yeah.
It could have been a completely different, we could be in a completely different musical landscape.
Yeah, well, that's true. And I mean, metal is it's a religion for some. It is for me in a way. And it's been it's my guiding force of what I listen to almost exclusively. And so I've got a particular opinion that's no doubt different from others you'll talk to who, as I'm sure you will, guys like Marcus aren't sworn metal guys, right? So probably has he had a different view from sort of the inner sanctum in Holland. So he would have seen things probably quite different to me. And so everyone's going to come with a different opinion, right or wrong, about what the decisions should have been.
Yeah.
And I was certainly, I'm much more, I'd be more like with Monty and others in the old stuck in the mud metal guys, right? Whereas others might say, well, don't be an idiot. Would never have worked, that metal strategy. You should have done this and that. And that's fair enough too. It's good. It's a good pub debate.
Yeah, definitely. What do you think the legacy is of the label? This is like the big rounding up question.
Well, I mean, it depends on who's looking at the legacy. For me personally, it's the most satisfying. I mean, I love what I do now, and I'm building my own company, and I can, and just, every day I have a sense of pride of that. But in terms of life, career, things that I've done, I mean, of course, it's still the most time of the lion's share of my life and my career was at Roadrunner. And, I look at it fondly, and any even if from this podcast, this conversation, I have no bitterness and no negative feelings. I mean, I may have certainly around the time when I got sacked, but as we probably all did, all of us who lost our jobs, but I don't hold any now. I just have an absolute love and fondness of the time. And I just know if there was reunions, it would be hugs and fist bumps and everything with everybody. There's no hard feelings, and it's all just, warm fuzzies, right? Because it was such an extraordinary time to be alive and to be in the music industry at that peak of sort of from mid-90s to 2012 for me was just unbelievable time to be involved in music and metal and rock and all of that. So legacy for me personally, best time of my life. For the world, it just showed that, and for Australia, I think there's still a lingering legacy that people do. Mates of mine in the music industry still just say, fuck, what you guys did at Roadrunner has just never been repeated. It's just the fact that you guys punched so higher above your weight. Mm-hmm. We were just, we at a certain point, I think we even got a point or two of market share in 2002 or 3 with how much business we were doing. We were so prominent, and we made such a mark, even like with the guys, if you spoke to the guys in major labels now that we worked with and said, what do you think of Roadrunner? And do you remember that? They'd be like, oh my God, yeah. They just absolutely killed it when they were chugging along. And I think the same, again, in the US, people just, for the business side of things, people would respect Roadrunner that we just did so many amazing things for a label that was small and indie. Yeah. And then for the punters, the label, most people who are Nickelback fans, probably neither here nor there that they were on Roadrunner, but for so many people still to this day, and I reckon for millennials and Zoomers even who are like dredging up the catalogs, there's this fascination with Roadrunner that there was this phenomena that was around from the 90s that just reinvented metal and rock and owned it, just completely fucking owned it.
Yeah.
And it's pretty good, right? I mean, you can say a lot of things about what you've done or what you've been a part of, but if you were part of doing something that was just your passion in life and the culture that you love, then you helped build it in your market from scratch, which is what I was lucky enough to do, and then go to New York and have a hand in that as well. It's not a lot of people get to do that, and that's an awesome thing to have been a part of. Right.
Let's wrap that up there. That was awesome. That was really, really enlightening, and especially into like the 2000 period, because I try and tackle this chronologically.